recording, Matt, I take it.
Yep.
All right. Well, now that we have a quorum, thank you all for coming. Let's call the meeting to order at 7:01. And I'll open it to public comment, recognizing that we don't have any members of the public here other than ourselves. But if anybody would like to speak on a topic that's not on the agenda, you're welcome to do that. Okay, so let's move on to minutes. I did have a little technical difficulty with the minutes. I wasn't able to sign in under my name. I was able to edit them, but something was different this time. I don't know what it was. It wouldn't.
Yeah, I didn't get prompted. I didn't get prompted for sign in.
Yeah,
either,
the email, I didn't get that.
But I was able to edit, and when I edited it, it didn't flag it as being altered.
Oh, okay. I edited, hopefully those actually made it into this. Yeah. Okay. So I'm guest user and I just put either my name or my initials in there.
Are you the purple?
So, no, I'm blue.
Oh,
yeah.
So,
blue.
so just to explain, I saw that you had edited because I got an email. And so I went back in and tried to clarify.
Oh, okay.
So you can look at what I've done and see if that is better.
Yeah, that looks much better. And I knew what the intent was, but the way it was phrased, I couldn't understand. Right. So, I mean, it was determined, right. The missing piece, I think, had been, well, yeah, that one sentence was really confusing. And then, you know, the ultimate sort of decision about a crosswalk at Williston Road in South Brownell, that's actually not really, I didn't really see it here.
That was
so
rejected
I
by
don't know if we're not add that in somewhere.
My understanding, tell me if this is right, is that it was said it was not okay with V-Trans. V-Trans nixed that idea. Yes?
No, I'm talking about Williston Road, crossing South Brownell at Williston Road.
Oh, sorry.
Which is the goal, right? That is the one that they would escrow money for.
Yes.
And that one is that's never called out. Like in this second to last sentence, V-Trans would like the sidewalk constructed only when crosswalks are in place. But construct a sidewalk from their property line west to South Brownell Road. I guess it would be clearer if it said along Williston Road.
Okay, sure.
Kate.
Hello.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you, Melinda.
These changes were in there when I read it and I was okay with all the edits.
Okay. You want to scroll down a little?
Because there's a lot here.
Yeah, so again, I came in after I saw your comment.
Okay.
And tried to clarify it. I think changing the zoning district boundaries addresses the goal of minimizing conflicts between residential zoning and other districts. I think that was the intent of the statement.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that makes more sense. Okay.
And then I believe that the grant is called Municipal Assistance Block Grant. And I can
okay.
double check that.
Yeah, I just feel like I didn't know that one. And I think in general, we need at least the first appearance. It should spell out acronyms. So we're all in our little world of alphabet soup, but folks looking back on this, or the public may not know, or even planning commissioners may not know what these are. Yeah, I think that was pretty much it. There was just a little typos here and there. Oh yeah, that one thing, I didn't know if there was a reference to Walmart, but I wasn't quite sure what that was about.
It was about to the loop of Harvest Lane down near Walmart.
Okay, so it was kind of like the amphitheater idea or something?
And yes, it was the idea of not having residential or other buildings in that loop, so that if it were used as an amphitheater, it wouldn't be a conflict of interest. So the Walmart is not very clear.
Right.
How about you could say the Walmart? It doesn't
what is
matter,
the name of that
just loop? I would call it Harvest Lane Loop,
okay,
because it's Harvest Lane all the way around, right? Or 3/4 around. Is that right, Melinda or Matt?
Mm-hmm.
That'd be great. Thanks. Yeah, so thank you. That looks great now, Melinda. Thanks for clarifying those things.
Okay.
So I'll entertain, if anybody has any other changes that you would like to add. If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes as amended.
I'll move.
Shape and move. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Okay, I heard Alex and saw Kate, so we'll just go alphabetically and say Alex. Alex second. All in favor, say aye or raise your hand so I can see it.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, looks unanimous. Any abstentions or no? Okay, or nays? All right. So looks like no notices from other jurisdictions. Is that still the case, Matt?
Correct.
Okay. So at this point, we can officially, I guess, open the public hearing.
Could I ask a question?
Oh, yes, sure. Go ahead, Ron.
Have we warned about this hearing? I didn't see a warning in this week's paper. I saw one for October, but not for tonight.
This was warned in the paper about a month ago.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Is it a 15 business day minimum or something like that?
15 calendar days.
Calendar days, okay.
You can count the day it's in the paper or the day of the hearing, but not both.
Okay.
That's what I've been told.
Yeah.
I didn't go back that many newspapers.
Okay, any other questions?
Well, and I just want to speak to Ron's question, because we do want to make sure the public is involved when they should be. But from my perspective, we've had hearings on all of these at other times. This was like pulling them together for final review. So I wasn't too worried.
Yeah. And Matt or Melinda, I have a question for you as we look through these amendments with the view toward passing them on to the select board. What is the status of any additional changes we want to make? Would we then have to warn another public hearing for ourselves, or would those get swept into the select board public hearing?
If you have changes to what you see in front of you tonight, if they're if they're generally small, you know, a wording issue, or I thought we had this in there and we don't, that can be made as part of the hearing, and you can,
Okay.
you can these as amended toward the select board. If there was something, you know, really
Major.
fundamentally different, I'd probably recommend continuing and holding another hearing just to give people an opportunity to react to it.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Okay, so I'm going to pretty much ask the staff to lead us through these. And I had to look through them. You know, it's very helpful having the track changes in there so that we can skim through and see them. There ideally wouldn't have been any surprises because we have been through all of these before, with the possible exception of the very last piece, where there were some, there were quite a few pages that, you know, there were I hadn't looked at before with changes, but they were really pretty minor. So that, I think the bylaw cleanup thing,
Yeah.
and you launched that.
Oh, yes.
It was massive. And I did not get through it all. I kind of skimmed it, but most of the changes seem to be kind of clarifications or, you know, making sure the correct state statute was cited, or the chapter and number of our own bylaw, those kinds of things. So, so I'll turn it over to you folks. And yeah, oh, sorry, Chapin, you have a question?
I just have a general comment, because we have been through all these changes before, and I think we're all agreed on where they stood. So I'm hoping this is just almost pro forma. But I wanted to say, as I was reading through them again, it is really hard to read them in the track. It's great to have the changes identified in track changes, but there are times when if it's additions or subtractions, it's easy to interpret, but where it's a change, it's really hard to read it and check whether it's going to come out right. So I'm counting on someone doing that. And if you would like me as a planning commission member to help with the final proofread, I'd just like to have access after this meeting to a version that has the changes incorporated, so I could go through just looking for any kind of typos from the process of editing, if that makes sense.
That would be really helpful, Chapin. You know, once you have it in Word form, you can choose not to view the tracking. So you can go to an area that's been modified, turn that view off, and hopefully it still reads grammatically. But sometimes there's a strike through that should have gone another 2 characters, or, you know, something.
Exactly. Exactly. And I'd be happy to help with that after this meeting.
Great.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'm going to mute myself now and let you folks take over.
Boy. So I want to give a brief introduction to the items that are up for hearing, and then we can dive into them at the pleasure of the group. We have a pretty diverse set of topics under consideration for amendment to the bylaw here. The first 2 and the last one, the cleanup, so watershed health, off-street parking and loading, and bylaw cleanup, these were all reviewed and actually heard at a public hearing by the Planning Commission on October 20th of 2020, or in October of 2020. I may have that backwards, but the commission held a hearing. We ended up getting into, at a staff level, a whole bunch of other things, as well as the crowded select board docket. And so we're just now getting around to getting those 3 things back to the select board. So those items are unchanged from what was heard by this group in its October 2020 iteration back then. We're just bundling them into this hearing. There's some statutory language about how long you have once something has been transmitted to the select board, how long they have to act. And we just want to be sure that we're in the clear in terms of that time frame by identifying these as part of this hearing as well. So I can go over them as folks have questions, but we've made no changes to those. So, really briefly, watershed health was about providing some flexibility from some of the town's watershed protection setbacks when there's a site that was developed prior to the adoption of those setbacks, and essentially exchanging a restoration of the part of the buffer closest to the wetland or stream in exchange for a little bit of relief in terms of impacting the outer parts of that buffer adjacent to a pre-existing structure. Off-street parking and loading involves some minor adjustments to the parking demand generation numbers, and then a lot of language about how applicants are to proceed with shared parking analysis and any proposed reductions from minimum required parking, and then a refinement of the parking demand generation tables to be clear about when and what kind of things like bicycle parking and ADA parking are required. And cleanup, as Megan identified, is all changes that are minor in nature. We think of cleanup as non-substantive changes. In other words, they don't change what is required under the bylaw. They either are a correction of a cross-reference or they make an existing requirement clearer to communicate and understand. So when we propose a sort of an omnibus cleanup like this, where it's the entire thing, the intent is not to have any substantive changes in that cleanup, but rather be able to say, these are just text changes that we want a set of eyes on, but we're fixing the statute reference, we're fixing the cross-reference, or something is being read 2 or 3 different ways and we all know what the right one is, but it needs to say it differently so that that's clear. So then last part of my introduction to these, the 2 other items are retail recreational cannabis and class 4 groundwater. Retail recreational cannabis does a couple of things. It does away with the permission for medical cannabis in the industrial district. It then consolidates allowances for both recreational and medical cannabis to be sold in the mixed-use commercial zoning district, i.e. the big box district containing Walmart, Home Depot, et cetera, and the Gateway District North. This is the west side of Route 2A up near the Essex boundary. Within the permission for this, there is a requirement that retail cannabis, recreational or medicinal, goes to the Development Review Board for approval before it can be operated. And there are requirements of minimum spacing between retail cannabis outlets and spacing from residential properties that are adjacent. So you have a 200-foot space to residential and a 1,000-foot space between outlets. That's my very brief summary of everything that's up tonight. I can take my cues from items that commission members have questions about or want to see again. We can take them in order. At the pleasure of the group, happy to work through it, whatever makes the most sense.
Matt, did you, well, why don't we pause and see if there are any questions about the retail recreational cannabis section?
Okay.
Anybody have questions or comments about that? All right, well, that's great. Let's move on to groundwater. I suspect this is an even shorter presentation.
Yeah, so Melinda, if you could open that up, that would be great. And then I might steal the screen share for a second in a minute. So class 4 groundwater is the state definition for groundwater that's been polluted with something that you don't want people to be in contact with. In this case, what we're talking about is the Commerce Street plume, or collectively known as the Superfund site. So there's a chemical in the ground emanating from a site on Commerce Street, tetrachloroethylene. It was a solvent that was disposed of in a septic system at that site and has proliferated through the groundwater out towards South Brownell Road and Shunpike Road. So we've been working for as long as I've been Williston and long before with both the state and federal EPA about what the mitigation plan is for this pollution. And generally the plan is to monitor it. And so both state and federal EPA are involved in an ongoing monitoring program. It does sort of attenuate or dilute over time, but it can also move. So there's a lot of the mitigation for this is not about trying to pump it out of the ground, but rather just pay attention to what's happening with it. However, from the state EPA, there was a desire that Williston enact some local restrictions about people doing excavation work in the area of the plume. So there's some boilerplate language that we worked on related to the plume and related to what could go in the bylaw. And this is this proposed edit in chapter 4. So Melinda, if you could share what that looks like right now.
Okay, sorry, I thought I had shared, but let me.
That's okay.
Okay, this one. Okay. Can everyone see?
So this is from the hearing draft. And essentially what this says is the state has rules about what has to happen if you're going to do work that might put people in contact with class 4 polluted groundwater, and you need to follow those rules. And what it really means is you need to have a work plan that says, here's what we're going to do to mitigate exposure of workers or citizens to that contaminated groundwater. This chapter 4 is our administrative procedures chapter in the bylaw. And this is where we have a few things that identify requirements that live outside of the bylaw that we really want to make sure people are following. So up above it, not edited, is some discussion about places in Williston that have FAA jurisdiction related to the airport, where we're just kind of warning people, you know, if you're near the airport, you might need to check in with the FAA. If you're near the Commerce Street plume, you might need to follow this rule related to contaminated groundwater. And what we're asking people to do is submit a letter showing that they understand that requirement and that they're going to follow that rule, and that they have a work plan prepared by an environmental professional that meets this rule. So I showed this hearing language to this person named John Halpern from the EPA, and he had a few minor recommended changes to it, which I want to show. I think I'll just excerpt it into a Word document so you don't see the whole email chain and get confused. And I just want to show you this. And the intent here is to say the same thing that's being said in this draft. Let me see if I can steal the screen share.
Do you want me to stop?
I've got it.
Okay.
We just tried to simplify this language a little bit. It's the same exact thing. We also took the website link away because it keeps moving. So what we're saying is, if you're applying for a permit in this area, you need to give us documentation that you're going to be in compliance with the rule and be certified by an environmental professional.
Is it an environmental professional or the environmental professional? Like, is there a specific?
I can, let me go back. Melinda, can you go back to the draft language? Because this is like the final sentence.
Sure. Hold on.
So this whole first sentence that talks about Commerce Street, Kirby Lane, swimming pools, foundations, basements, etc. That all is still there. Actually, I think the link to the rule is still there. We were just working on this last sentence. So we say up here, under the supervision of an environmental professional as defined, and then there's a section of the rule that defines who that is. So that's why we say the environmental professional in my revision of that final sentence of this section.
Okay. Did you need an and in there?
Yeah, so this doesn't have an or the in the the thing on Linda's screen.
And
yeah,
I gotcha. Okay.
Do we have class 4 groundwater defined anywhere?
The definition exists in that Vermont DEC rule.
I see.
So what I've said is it's DEC's designation. We could add a definition into the definition section, but it would probably just say class 4 groundwater is defined as such by Vermont DEC, and then C,
right.
C section would be a little bit circular.
Right. Well, as long as people can figure out what it means with that link.
The main, procedurally, the main thing here is for the zoning administrator to try to remember when people are doing work near Commerce Street, that
right.
there's a requirement. And to be honest, I think everybody who works in zoning in Williston gets told very early on, do you know we have a Superfund site? Do you know there's the Commerce Street plume? And then what has traditionally happened, and Ken Beliveau would recount the story of, someone came in for a permit to tear down a house and build a brand new house in the vicinity of the plume. And it just felt wrong to just go and sign this permit for this new house with a full basement in the plume area. And Ken called the EPA and said, I'm about to, put my name on this permit for a brand new house in the Superfund area. What should I do? And they said, well, we don't really, we advise people to, ventilate the foundation underneath, not have living space below grade, but it's just advice. Okay. So this is a little better than that, at least.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Any other comments or questions about this groundwater issue?
No.
All right. So if there are no other comments, and I'm happy to pause a moment to see if anyone does have additional comments or questions. But otherwise, I think we can probably move to a vote. And I'm assuming we can vote on all of these together, Matt?
You're fine to do that procedurally. Are there any members who feel different about one or the other of these?
Yeah,
I do. I would prefer if we voted individually.
Okay.
Sorry to make extra work.
That's fine. Kate, did you have a comment?
Well, I was just going to say minus the bylaw cleanup, obviously, but those items.
Yeah. Does anyone have any further questions about the bylaw cleanup?
I wasn't able to look at all of them, so.
I confess I didn't look at all of them either. I looked at a few. I'm also curious what anything that Alex has, it must be a question about one of them or a concern about one of them, and I'd like to know before I vote.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. I actually expressed my concern in an earlier meeting, Chapin, when I was first on the board about the off-street parking numbers. So I'm just going to vote consistent with what I said in that meeting.
Wait, could you remind me what it was?
Just that I don't support reducing the requirements for residential parking. So
I recall that. I can offer to you folks, if there's no other divergence, you're welcome to package the other ones together if it's easier, but I'm happy to take notes on motions and seconds for each at a time as well.
Is everyone comfortable with voting first on the parking, off-street parking and loading section of this, and then we can do the rest of them bundled together? Is that okay?
I would want to vote against the retail cannabis bylaw.
Oh, okay. So, all right, you know what, let's just do each one separately then. Okay, so that people can vote in individual ones. Okay, so I'll take a motion for voting. We'll just go in order that they appear. First on watershed health. Do we need a motion or do we just vote?
You should do a motion and second for each. And,
right.
And the vote is to move this forward to the select board for consideration.
Yes. Okay. So I will entertain a motion. Okay.
I'll motion
thank
to
you.
accept, yeah.
I'll second. Go ahead,
I think
Kate.
that was Alex making the motion and Kate seconding. Is that fair? Okay. All in favor of moving watershed health onto the select board, please raise your hand or say aye so I can see or hear you.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay. Any nays? Can't actually see everybody at the same time. Let me squeeze this down. Okay. So that passed unanimously. Next is off-street parking and loading. Can I have a motion to review that for voting?
I'll move that we move that onto the select board.
Okay. Okay, I'll go ahead and second that. And all those in favor of approval of the off-street parking and loading amendment, moving it on to the select board, please raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
Okay, and if you are opposed to the off-street parking and loading, please raise your hand. Okay, so we have 3 nay votes and I guess no abstentions. Okay, so that one will not be moved forward to the select board at this point. Retail recreational cannabis. Can I have a motion to move that on to select board?
I'll motion.
Okay, moved by Alex.
I'll second.
Second. Thank you, Kate. Those in favor? Sorry, of course I'm losing my voice. Those in favor of moving retail recreational cannabis amendment onto select board, please say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed? 1 opposed. And I guess no abstentions. All right, so that one will go on to the select board. Class 4 groundwater, I have a motion to move that one ahead.
So moved.
So, okay.
Okay, Ron moved. I'll take that as a second from Chapin. Those in favor of moving class 4 groundwater language amendment onto the select board, raise your hand or say aye.
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 All right, that was unanimously passed. And the final one is bylaw cleanup. Can I have a motion for moving that on to select board?
So moved.
From Ron?
Correct.
Second from Alex. Those in favor of moving that on to select board, please raise your hand or say aye.
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 Those opposed?
I think I'm going to abstain. I didn't get a chance.
All right, so 0 nay votes and 1 abstention. Okay. Thank you all for that round of voting.
So right. we have to decide what we're doing with the parking one.
Yes. So my sense is that we should probably, as a commission, preferably with all 7 of us, revisit the language and see if there are distinctions that could be made that that would change that language. Is that pretty much what you were envisioning, Matt?
Yeah, what we can do, I'll put it in our email. Well, let me back up. There's really two paths here. One would be you can do what you're suggesting. Folks can look at it, suggest edits that would make them comfortable with it. I know, Alex, you identified specifically the reduction in requirement around residential. And there might be some other things for folks looking at that. The other thing I'll suggest is that we're going to be addressing parking in Taft Corners under form-based code. So it may make sense to table this for a little while, knowing that there's a chapter on parking in the draft form-based code coming anyway. And you may want to look at that.
Go ahead, Chapin.
My concern is that our first mention of parking canopies for solar and stuff like that, and also credits for charging, is in this change the bylaw, and I would like it to apply to every new project that comes in. And so I don't want to lose time on that if we don't have to. So I would be amenable to removing the changes to the parking numbers for residential, or leaving them the way they were, in order to get the rest of the changes through if we could.
Okay.
Would you say that's a substantial enough change, Matt, that we would need to warn another hearing?
No. What I would suggest is, how are we doing for time? I feel like we have a fair amount of time here. Oh yeah. Gosh, it's only 20 of 8.
That doesn't mean we have to fill the time.
I'm not going to make you fill the time, but what I would say is this: is if the concern is primarily around residential and the residential number, which I think is what I'm hearing, but we can open that up and take a look at that draft real quick, or you can just say that you want to continue this hearing for that element, and we can open it up next time after everybody's had a chance to look at it. I know it's been a long time. I'd be happy to share up that document and just run back down to that part on residential.
That section of that document is one of the ones that's hard to read in change mode. So I wouldn't mind if we all had access to a Word version that let us turn on and off viewing changes.
Yeah, I was going to express the same, Chapin. Like, I'm fine with either tabling it for form-based code or continuing it and voting on it. My particular changes are pretty narrow, and I'm totally supportive of the solar stuff that's in there, et cetera. So, I mean, if you guys want to table it, send a Word document, and can just have this vote next in 2 weeks, I'd be happy to do that.
Megan, I have a question for you as chair. Were the other 2 people that didn't vote for it concerned for the same reason, or is it just that one row, or is it it might be 2 rows in that table?
Kate and Ron, do you want to?
Yeah, that's where my concern is as well.
Well, I had issues with parking, so I like the Taft Corner look at all of the parking issues, because I'm not ready to agree to it. But we can still vote on it again tonight or next week. I would want to have more time to think about it.
Ron, can I ask if the section that was of concern to you, was that similar to Kate and Alex's concern, or were there different elements of it that you were concerned about?
It's the count and what's available, and the sharing is the one that I have issues with, of how that actually happens, because it doesn't work well here in the hamlet today.
Matt, do you want to respond to that at all?
So let me see if I can pull it apart. There's a couple things happening. The first is what we've already talked about, which is the draft reduces the amount of parking for residential uses. And without looking at it, I can't remember exactly where we went, but I think we went from 1.75 spaces per unit on multifamily residential, maybe down to 1.5 or 1.25. And I think we went from, I think we left single family residential alone, if I remember correctly, because it just becomes kind of nonsensical to try to think about single family residential as having required parking spaces. And then, you know, Ron, I think what you're alluding to is there's a lot of language in here about dealing with the parking share. So the broad brush that this draft does is it mostly uses the generation numbers from the current draft, but it allows a reduction down to 80% of that, what is today understood as a minimum, more or less just as an acceptable range of somewhere between 80 and 100% of that parking generation can be constructed. If you go below that, if you really, really, really want to reduce your parking, you get into the shared arrangements. And that's a share between two private landowners or one landowner with multiple kinds of uses proposing a share because the parking demand is happening at different hours of operation. So in other words, the peak demand is happening at a different time. One thing's a restaurant and the other thing is an office, and the restaurant fills up at dinner time when the office is empty, like Texas Roadhouse and the office building next to it there. But there's some language in the draft that allows a much finer calculation of that share and the use of some modeling software that was created for the town by RSG to do that analysis. It's pretty onerous to you know, if somebody really wants that, they're really going to have to put some work into showing that those hours of peak demand actually line up. So that's a change that is in there.
Matt, just to clarify, can I ask you a question? So are you saying that, I recall the discussion of the like algorithm for analyzing the sharing possibility, but is that limited to commercial properties, or is there some capacity for the sharing to happen with residential? Or do we even specify that?
Let me bring this draft up because I want to do it right from the chapter, and I just want to check something.
While Matt's doing that, I just comment that I watched the DRB meeting from a week ago or so with the conversion of the hotel to residential, and that was part of the discussion under the current zoning laws, was how much of that on-street parking was considered a buffer for the residential parking in the hotel.
Right. So,
is that the specific thing is on Day Lane? Is that the specific thing you were talking about, Ron?
Well, yes, that's not the only one, but we have other arrangements with other properties here with our homeowners association, with the condos, and then the developer, and then with Public Works. And we feel like we've lost parking space. We've lost control of the parking in the hamlet from what we were told and what was written into the declarations, which from our point of view are it's part of our deed, and it was part of the permit that the town issued, but it's like a shuffling. And so we're, from this time last year, we've lost more parking in the hamlet. So that's what I was hoping when Matt mentioned the Taft Corners farm-based code, to see what we can do, because the present situation is not acceptable here, and we don't really know how it's going to turn out.
But my understanding is that the present situation is not a result of this tool that RSG developed. Is that correct, Matt?
Correct. I mean, that tool has not been it's
right.
It's not regulations.
Yeah, I think we're caught in the middle here. So we're a project that's 13 years old, and the rules are changing, but the rules we thought we were working under haven't been implemented over a 13-year period. So now we've lost spaces through that process that we weren't anticipating.
Chapin, go ahead.
Yeah, and that is why I sort of added that piece of information about what I thought it was, that was because obviously the current problem occurred under current zoning and isn't a result of these changes, but I can't say that I know how these changes would affect it in the future. So I think that's Ron's point.
Yeah.
I keep trying to go for a better deal. So if we have a farm-based code improves it at least gives it some definitive standard that I don't have to hire an attorney and take everybody to court to figure out how many parking spaces we have. That's the frustration we're having here is we're just basically waiting for the next shoe to drop to tell us what are the rules here in our part of the neighborhood. So I'm transferring the issues I have here with some future development situation. So I was just not going to vote for parking tonight and just ignore it. But we've got more people involved, so I'll defer to whatever Alex and Kate want to do. But I wanted to make a big stink about it. You know me. That there's an issue here that didn't work out as the way it was written down on paper, and I'm just being pedantic to hang on to my rules as best as I can.
So Megan, asking the chair, I would be interested if staff could give us clarification on how, not right now maybe, but maybe at the next meeting if needed, on how these changes would affect the current thing, and whether what we might do in form-based code will jump us so far ahead that we don't need to pursue this. Mm-hmm. However, I don't want to lose some of the changes that are in the current one. And so if we can continue a long discussion tonight, I would be in favor of that in terms of we could reach something that we could forward in order to get some of the positive changes in with whatever isn't liked cut out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and you're suggesting, Chapin, that we do that by continuing this hearing?
Yes. Well, no, I think right now we could go through and make it so that Alex and Kate are okay with it, and I would be okay with it because I'll go with the majority. I think Ron's issues, we may decide to continue it, and certainly I would be interested in the staff understanding of that, but I wonder if we should treat that as a second issue and see if we can get agreement on the residential parking numbers first.
Okay, Matt, your thoughts on that suggestion?
I think that can work, and I think I have a good explanation queued up for the, I think what I'm hearing from Ron about the oversubscription of sharing with street parking.
Yes.
So I can bring the draft up and just point to that as well as the line related to residential, if that's productive. I don't think it'll take time.
That sounds great.
All right. Let me get this zoomed in. Oh, and centered. It's a delicate balance here. Okay, hopefully that's legible. So we're in a section here that says, what if I want to build less parking on site? How can I do that? We have an existing section that says, have on-street parking nearby. This is the on-street parking spaces within 600 feet of a main entrance. So this has come up as an element of discussion with the Champlain Housing Trust project. And currently, the section ends by saying you can't reduce below two parking spaces per dwelling unit, which is actually more than we require today per dwelling unit in a multifamily, by offsetting to street parking. And what we have in the draft right now is we set the limit a little lower and say you can't reduce below 1.5 per dwelling unit. But we add the requirement that the applicant actually perform a shared parking analysis on those street spaces, just like we would make somebody who's proposing a share with another private lot do that. So under today's rule, you could have 1, 2, or 50 landowners all pointing at the same, 10 street spaces and saying, I'm offsetting to those street spaces, and that's allowed. What the edit does here is it says, if you want to do that, you will need to provide an analysis to prove to us that those street spaces aren't already in such great demand that we really shouldn't be counting them against what you need to do on site.
So in a way, then it does sound like this would address some of Ron's concerns.
I think it could.
It could.
I think the DRB was trying to do this at the hearing anyway. They were trying to say you need to prove it to us about these spaces, but we actually got ahead of this a year ago and tried to codify that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So that's helpful for me, because I think reading through this, one of the other problems in addition to the track changes is that we don't necessarily know what the present looks like, and the present practice, I guess. But this is helpful. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for that. Shall we dive into some, or are there any other questions about this piece of it?
Well, the confusion that I have is that we as homeowners here are not allowed to park on the street by declaration, but the town isn't enforcing that. So a bunch of people are parking on the street, but by declaration, the homeowners can't. And then a lot of the homeowners were working under the assumption there's only parking on the west side of Day Lane. And from the DRB meeting, it sounded like, oh no, there's parking on the east side also. And that's what frightens most people, is the consumption of the parking spaces. So if we can make the formula be less spaces, then instead of 10 spaces, turn out to 5 or whatever. But we need to have a formula or a study, long-winded, to analyze what the situation is here. And it may not apply here, but down the road in 10 years, it may apply somewhere else. Mm-hmm. This is a lot like water in West Texas being oversubscribed. Parking spaces are at a premium in our part of town.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And sounds like there's also some what do they call it, like overlapping jurisdictions, when you have like the town, but then you also have a homeowners association, other kinds of issues exactly. There. Kate, go ahead, and then Alex.
Yeah, I mean, I just and I think it is to Ron's point. I'm not exactly sure, but I'm concerned. I don't know how this would play out. And so I'm a little concerned about saying, oh, you don't have to provide spaces because there's some street parking or whatever down the block, and then the people who live there can't find a parking spot because they've taken it up with whoever. I don't know if you've ever tried to park in like Burlington. It's impossible, and I wouldn't want Williston to end up like that. where you're driving around blocks for, 20 minutes to try and park your car.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. There's also, I mean, this is kind of coming in from a different angle, but there's just to kind of quickly respond, there's also, if parking is easy and free all the time, then people are much more likely to drive everywhere. And if, part of our goal is to facilitate people taking public transit and walking and cycling to their destinations, particularly I'm thinking of, the growth center, then having ubiquitous, free, and plenty of parking is not necessarily the right strategy. So I'm not necessarily advocating that. I'm just saying, like, there are these sort of analyses that go both ways. Alex, go ahead.
So a couple of things. I'll respond to your response and just to say there's a big difference between the carrot and the stick, right? If you want to facilitate people using multi-mode, it's one thing. It's another thing to try to force them to do it, right? Especially in an area that snows 6+ months out of the year, et cetera. Right. So I take issue with that as sort of the first step. So I know you said you weren't advocating it, but I just think it's questionable to try to force that on people and end up accidentally creating a place that's not a great place to live and work, which is the beginning of our mission. Right. What I was going to ask more specifically when I originally raised my hand is Matt, I've read through this about 5 times now, and I'm trying to understand, and maybe this is something I don't understand about a shared parking analysis, but where does it sort of require that these spaces not be multi-claimed? Where does it say, like, hey, it's 1.5 per dwelling unit? How does it actually avoid the issue of 10 different developments pointing at the same on-street parking?
So,
it doesn't say nobody can make a claim to it. It doesn't say that you have to prove that anything in this study, and nor does it say, like, that like we're going to keep a list of who's claimed which spots or anything like that.
Right. So the way this would work under the parking tool is you would assume that every use with an entrance within 600 feet of that street space was placing demand on that street space, whether it had been claimed by that landowner or not. So, even if the person on the other side of the street has a giant off-street parking lot, you're still assuming that some of their customers or workers or residents are placing demand on the street space. So you're literally just counting up the uses that are proximate to the space and then looking at their demand generation as it relates to those street spaces. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I didn't know about the 600-foot assumption of demand. That makes sense. So the parking analysis, they would sort of effectively have to prove there were enough spots that were not already sort of going to be claimed automatically by things within 600 feet.
Right.
So they'd have to be able to add enough on-street parking to complement what already existed.
Well, or they just can't claim. If you look at, say, in Ron's example, street parking spaces by the proposed CHT property, and you say, well, there are X number of residences and X number of businesses within 600 feet of those spaces of certain sizes, and they are all generating demand on those spaces already. So to some degree, you might look at that and say, well, based on what we know about those uses and how big they are, those street spaces are already oversubscribed, and we shouldn't be giving anybody new credit against those spaces.
Okay, I understand the mechanism now. Thank you. And so the follow-up question to that is where does 1.5 per dwelling unit equivalent come from? Do we know what the average number of cars per dwelling unit equivalent in town is?
We don't know it specifically in town, but these numbers are based on the Institute of Traffic Engineers, or ITE, parking generation manual. And that actually, that manual has fallen somewhat out of date. It tends to assume larger household sizes than are typical anymore. When we started this edit, you'll notice that this edit reduces what's allowed. You can't, this used to say you can't go below 2. It now says you can't go below 1.5. And that's based on the ITE manual already for multifamily says 1.75 as a maximum. So this takes a guess.
I just know that the census already says there's 1.88 per household nationally on average. And I believe, if I recall correctly, that we are actually above average in Vermont, and which is pretty explainable by the fact that we're higher income and by our, you know, bad weather, et cetera. So I would really want to see 2 here, because this sort of goes together with my general concern about the reductions we've made to residential parking requirements throughout. So, I mean, I'm fine with this language with the clarification, but I would really want to see 2 here personally.
Okay. Well, I think that's a parallel to what you might be doing in the general demand generation number if you're proposing editing that as well. So, you know, basically what this really comes down to, especially in a mixed use property, is how many spaces are there on site for people who live there? You know, I think there's an acknowledgement in this bylaw already that it's one thing to share spaces among the users of commercial sites. It's another thing when you start talking about residential. What we've tried to add into this edit is an understanding that residential and commercial actually can share fairly well because they're really different in terms of when the peak demand is.
I think that's changed a little post-COVID too, to be frank. So
yeah, for people who work from home, it certainly has. I saw a couple of raised hands, Megan.
Yeah, I'm waiting for the end of the comments. Okay, Chapin, go ahead.
A couple things. The first is probably the most important, which is I'm fine just taking this change out for now. You know what I mean? I'm wanting to get other changes through, and I'm willing to sacrifice anything. So if that solves the problem for the moment, we're going to deal with this later in form-based code, hopefully. And so I just want to put out there that I'm okay with that. The second is that the situation in the hamlet is quite unique, and I find a hard time believing, Ron, that your declaration that says that residents can't park on the street still takes precedence over town rules now that the town owns the street. You know, I think the street is in town control, so don't their rules apply rather than the declaration?
No, I've had an attorney says the rules still apply. I've had 2 attorneys tell us that.
Okay. And
so we'd have to modify our declaration to do it, which,
okay.
And that could happen.
Okay. And finally, I just see that Day Lane is an example of where if there were metered spaces, it would solve a lot of the problems because then people wouldn't take a space up for the whole day. But you'd have spaces for short term. Yeah. Thanks.
There's issues over the Day Lane. I'm jumping in here, assuming I'm next, but stop me if so it's a special situation. But y'all heard me complain about oversized vehicles and drop-off trailers and slide-off storage sheds. They get put in the street and take up parking spaces. And that I don't see that calculated here, and I don't know of how to control the big tractor trailer trucks parking and taking up 3 spaces and how that goes into the calculation. It may not be happening now as much with the hotel no longer in existence, but we have a lot of landscape crews come through with big trailers and mowers, and they take up all of Center Street and sometimes both sides of Center Street with their equipment parked on the road right in front of that driveway. So it's a mess, and that's kind of why I just bring it up.
Well, a lot of those
I agree
kinds,
taking it off the table.
I wonder if a lot of those kinds of uses would, you know, aren't really, I'm not sure, sorry, I'm not sure that the bylaw is the place to or the mechanism to deal with those things, because they're very, like things like landscape trucks and, you know, these slide off storage units that, you know, that's,
Well, what happens is they get parked on the parking lot, and the cars that are supposed to be on the parking lot then get pushed out into the street.
I see,
So
right.
they need to be part of the study, the calculation of how often it happens, so that if we do a parking study, do we have the spaces available based on current use?
Okay. Any other conversation about the 14.2, 4.5.2? All right, shall we move on to the other section of concern? Yeah, go ahead, Kate.
Sorry, I just want to confirm what we're doing with it. So are we going
to
increase it to 2 or leave it the way it was? I mean, I'm not necessarily, in considering the offset for nearby public parking, you know, they should require a parking analysis. That's not necessarily a bad thing to add.
Mm-hmm.
So
right,
we could just say fewer than 2 per dwelling unit, and then, or I know Chapin had said take the whole thing out. I don't know what the group.
Yeah, I'd rather keep it, given what Matt explained, and change 1.5 to 2. I think, you know, I'd be willing to vote for it. This section, you know, other changes notwithstanding for a second.
I agree.
And I would agree, just to obtain a consensus here. If it's 2, that 1.5 or 2 is not really my issue. It's what gets calculated into that 2.
Matt, one thing that occurs to me is and I don't think we can deal with this right here because this is really for permitting. But it almost sounds like when there are other kinds of changes, we need to be able to, you know, it could be land use or different kind of, you know, commercial operation or something like that. I wonder if there needs to be a provision for that kind of shared parking analysis to be triggered, kind of, you know, not only when a site is first developed, but maybe in circumstances of land use changes, different commercial operations, those kinds of things. And I realize that's not something we want to address right here, but maybe just something to kind of put in our our list, our never-ending list, right?
I have great news for you because I think this proposed edit actually addresses that.
Oh, okay, great.
A lot of the things you're talking about are things that don't come before the DRB, right?
Okay.
So someone's just going to change the use of a building from one commercial to another. And this chapter, let me just zip up to the top real quick. One of the proposed edits is, do these standards apply? Yes. And they apply to all development. And it used to just say for permit is required. We've added this language of administrative or discretionary, meaning things that Melinda or I sign off on, or things the DRB signs off on, to really be clear that anything that requires a permit, which most changes of use do, could trigger the full ride in terms of looking at parking. And the intent here is to not have a site develop with a certain amount of parking and then have it just sort of change use over time without any oversight over that. But rather give the administrator the entry to say, you need to give me an analysis to show me this is going to work, because the numbers say there's not enough. Even for a very simple, you know, they're not they're not doing anything to the building or site. They're just changing what's inside the building. What feels very minor can actually have a big impact on this stuff. So we did want to be clear about that. Does that answer your concern?
Yeah, that's great. Okay,
great.
Thank you for that. Okay. Okay, so let's move on to the concerns that Alex and Kate were sharing earlier.
Yeah. I think this is just the number of spaces required for residential. And
yeah, it was this table. This
so
is going to be tough
for,
to review.
I know this thing is kind of a mess. And I'm going to have to zoom out a little bit. Oh,
I think it was on the first wide page, Matt, if I recall correctly.
Okay, thank you, Alex.
There you go.
Sorry,
Right
residential. There. So, parking spaces. And what we had, sorry, so it's really the strike through down here. So we had, we were getting rid of the requirement for 1 and 2 family dwellings because they just come with parking. Basically, there was an idea here that maybe we really don't need to regulate this, and that sometimes when, because what this table is really talking about is maximums, and then what you can do working down from the maximum, that this didn't make sense. Accessories, we just kept at 1. Almost every accessory dwelling unit is a studio. I don't think I've done a 2-bedroom accessory dwelling unit the whole time I've been here. And I think this was the one that was at issue. So the multiple family dwelling, this is hard to see, but what it did was it went from 1.75 down to 1.5. So remembering that a big part of this is that this table used to be a minimum and a maximum. It's really just a maximum now. And then you have these various methods using shared parking, et cetera, that let you work down from it. So
is there no minimum? So somebody could come in and just, say a multiple family dwelling with no parking, it's all good? Or,
no,
or am I misunderstanding?
You make the calculation based on what's in this table. You can propose anywhere from 100% of what this table says that you need to build down to 80% of what this table says you need to build. If you want to go any lower than that, which often happens when there's a lot of shared parking, you have to undertake this much more extensive analysis that Appendix J calls for.
Would it be correct then to say that it would be perfectly within the rules to propose 1.2 spaces per unit, because that is 80% of the 1.5 that is on here? So somebody could propose 1.2 and you guys wouldn't really be able to stop them wouldn't be able to require an analysis or anything. Is that correct?
I think the way it works, let me just get to that section, Alex, because I want to be sure I'm.
And you're going by the section that I care about.
All right, so that's if you want to go over.
I just might point out, if you don't mind, also that market forces are at play here too, and so that's going to at least partially dictate what happens. And there's a point where you couldn't get away with developing a number of dwelling units with not enough parking.
I appreciate,
kind of have a handle.
I totally appreciate what you're trying to say, Melinda. Like, you guys have heard me. I'm relatively like a market will figure it out kind of guy, but for somebody who falls very far on the spectrum of the market will figure it out, I don't think we want to rely on caveat emptor as our basic structure for making sure we have good, high quality housing in town. I think, having good quality housing has sufficient parking that works for people. What you don't want is some short-sighted developer to build something that becomes, And I used to see this all the time when I lived in Puerto Rico, where they didn't build enough parking, and then you have a blight. You have basically an unsellable, development that sits there for years and ends up in foreclosure and is covered in weeds and whatever, all because somebody just, tried to get cheap on parking. So market will work things out, but it'll work it out in bankruptcy court over a 10-year period. I think we just want to ensure good quality housing and that people don't get, caveat emptor is a bad way to manage quality housing. It's Latin for buyer beware, if anyone is not aware.
So to your question, Alex, the real heavy analysis kicks in if you want to go below 80%.
So at 1.2 spaces per unit, nobody would have to do a heavy analysis.
No.
If that feels really low to me. This is a similar place where I would think with a 1.9 is the number in the link I sent in the chat, average number of cars per dwelling unit in the US. And I checked the Vermont census and we come out right about exactly the same. With that as just the number of cars that people have, it feels like we're setting a maximum that's a significant percentage below that is just going to lead to more of the types of problems that Ron is talking about, where you end up with a house with not enough parking and it affects sort of quality of life and quality of the town and all of that.
Ethan, go ahead.
Me? Sorry, I just sort of wanted to argue that if you look around Williston at a much finer level than what you're talking about, Alex, anybody who's rural or suburban probably averages 3 vehicles per single family house. And I don't know what it is per duplex. But then if you look at the stuff at Finney Crossing, it's a very different thing. And I really hope that for our denser areas, it may be that we need to be more specific about where we're talking about parking. Although I think that projects that are in the suburban and rural area, the market drives it almost immediately because you can't sell a house that you can't park at. Whereas what we're talking about is much more developments, things like Eagle Place or like what Finney Crossing has. And to me, that when we're denser and in the growth center, we should be attracting people who don't need to drive as much. And I don't know, we have to make a guess about where to place that. And that's part of why I'm willing to just strike the whole thing.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah, please.
I'm hearing that the focus here is on residential. What I would suggest is that the more rigorous analysis under Appendix J be proposed at anything less than 100% for residential. Where we see significant overages, i.e. too much parking created, is primarily in commercial areas. Mm-hmm. So, this is my example of signing a permit for Maple Tree Place to add 240 spaces to their site based on existing demand, and feeling like, they have 25 to 30% more than they use already, but our numbers at the time supported it. And I think that would follow a general pattern in the bylaw that, at least the way I think this was drafted in 2009, the intent was to get residential users off the street in the event of a snow emergency. So rather than can the entire reduction language, I would suggest just possibly considering carving out residential and saying you got to build it for residential. In commercial, somewhere between 80 and 100% is probably okay. And if you want to go lower than that, you've got to analyze it. So that's a suggestion.
I like that compromise. And I think it also reflects the fact that, our commercial areas, which are mostly in Taft Corners, we already, we know that we have tremendous amounts of parking, much of it underutilized. And so I think by targeting those commercial uses and it's not saying no, it's just saying you have to do more analysis, right?
Yeah, I understand that.
Excuse me, Alex, I'm not done.
Sorry.
Thank you.
I thought you were done.
So if we can so if we can, you know, carve out the residential from the commercial, that I think, you know, I agree, Matt, that would kind of solve some of these issues. Go ahead, Alex. And then I want to hear from Ron.
And Ron has his hand up, so
yes, I know.
Go in order by hand up.
Well,
okay.
Go ahead and let Alex. I can wait.
I was just going to say, you can solve the same problem since residential is already carved out, right? It has its own line, its own number, by just increasing the target for residential because it's a maximum, right? For example, if we increase the target to 2, it would allow someone to do, you know, 1.8, which is below the average per household, 1.6 even, which is significantly below the average per household. So it would accommodate something like what Chapin's talking about. And I totally appreciate the sort of, you know, Finney Crossing is different than, you know, at the rural side of town. I agree completely. At 2 per unit, this becomes, to me, a little more tenable. The maximum is set to something reasonable that I think could accommodate, say, like a, you know, a luxury housing development where everybody wanted to see that amount of parking, right? They want to see, let's say, dedicated spaces, 2 per unit, right? Whereas 1.5 is the current maximum here, right? So I think 2 is a much more reasonable unit, and I think everything else works. I think it's the only thing you really have to change. And you would achieve the same thing as what Matt is talking about, is sort of separating the level at which it occurs for residential. And so I just think 2 is a better number here. Sorry.
Ron, go ahead.
Now, the issue I wanted to bring up is the Hamlet subdivision and parts of the Finney Crossing are in mixed use territory. So we have commercial and residential, and we get treated like commercial, and I have arguments with folks that this is a residential district within a mixed use zone. Just, you know, to pick fights with people, but we need to be treated here in the hamlet as a residential district because that's how we're built out. That's the use we're using. But if we have commercial standards put on top of us, that could possibly create problems in the future.
What are your thoughts on that, Matt?
So I guess a couple things. First off, we certainly calculate demand based on a variety of uses. So we don't draw a boundary around a project and deem it one or the other. We actually count up uses and their intensities. But and we have the same parking requirements right now, no matter what zoning district you're in. It's only based on what type of use is present. So I guess, Ron, where I feel like the focus goes is back to the de facto sharing that's happening of the street spaces and the possibility that demand, because there's both commercial and residential there, has kind of overflowed. Am I getting this right?
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead. Since you asked the question, I'll take the floor. There is conflict here with the various commercial activities going on. And then with the small homes, the residents in the hamlet and the single homes, a lot of them turn their garage into a gym. And the declaration says your parking space is, you get 2, one's the garage and one's the itty bitty driveway out front. So, and then I have several homes where there's 6 or 8 cars that they're trying to park in 2 spaces, and then the guest overflow lot. And it's humans trying to live in a pretty dense area. So that's the pushback I'm giving y'all, is just it's hard to start extracting and coming up with a solution. But if that's, I think the whole idea where we do a study, especially in this part of town, to make sure there's enough spaces and we're not oversubscribed.
Okay, additional comments or questions? Yeah, go ahead, Kate.
So I was trying to look at this table and how it has changed, because it used to be minimum maximum, right?
Yes, today it's a minimum and a maximum.
Right. But what is the current, like all I see changed is 1.75. Was that the minimum or the?
No, that's now just a maximum. So
that's currently the maximum is 1.75.
Correct.
So it didn't list any
proposal.
minimums, or?
So under today's bylaw, what this table says is this is the one number. It's both as many and as few as you're allowed to build. And then there are adjustments allowed for things like sharing and proximity to transit, but it's all kind of nebulous. And so what we wanted to do here was focus on what's really happening is that there's a maximum number. There's still kind of the same methods that you can build more than the maximum if you want, but we've added the solar canopy as an idea there. And then we've really clarified and added rigor and specified the method by which you can go way below this maximum. So part of it, as drafted, it builds in that 80% to 100% flexibility. And what we've discussed tonight is by one way or another, not affording that flexibility to residential, or essentially keeping a de facto minimum for residential in place by making the number bigger, like Alex suggested, which, you know, mathematically it works either side. So that's part of it. This is a maximum. There are still ways to build more than the maximum if you really, really want to, built into this. It's also still a minimum in that the bylaw imagines somebody building less than this number, but only to a certain percentage. So, you know, we picked 80% as, you know, generally you can go down to 80% of this maximum, and that's okay. That's just within the realm of flexibility. And I can tell you that, you know, we've had a lot of folks by one method or another who have pretty much gone to 80% without incident, but the methodology behind it has been really unclear. Sure, we'll buy our employees transit passes, and then, you know, nobody enforces that, nobody checks it. Or sure, we have a parking share, but there was never really a specified way of actually coming up with that number. So that's why we wanted to add those things. And the other part has been, you know, in our multi-tenant commercial sites, the experience of providing somewhere between 80 and 100% of the numbers in this table has been okay. There's not been a lot of conflict. It appears to me, both from folks' experience tonight and what we've seen before, that the conflict really comes when you're pitting commercial against residential, or residential against residential, and oversubscribing a small number of street spaces.
Okay. Kate, go ahead.
Sorry, I have one more question. So
Sure.
If the concern that we have is primarily about commercial, you know, like the Shaws and those parking lots, but we don't seem to address that at all in this. This is all primarily looking at residential, all our changes, that is. Well, there's theaters, I guess. Is that accurate?
This table has all of the commercial uses in it as well on the next page. Sorry, if I can get there. Schools, offices, retail, services.
I know, but that's the current, right?
Yeah, so we're not changing these numbers at all, but, you know, you're going to do a quality restaurant at 20 spaces per 1,000 square feet. You're going to come up with, say, 100 spaces you need. What this bylaw lets you do is say, I'm going to build 80 or 85, and I'm not going to have to do a lot of rigorous analysis or agree to a lot of conditions to do that. But if I want to go any lower than that, or I've got a multi-tenant thing with some restaurants and some stores and some offices, and now each of those individual uses is coming out below 80% of whatever this table says you need to do, you're going to have to go to Appendix J and do a computer modeling that goes, you know, it's day by day, hour by hour, month by month on demand, and really show that to the best of our knowledge, that's going to work.
So the key thing is at the very top where it says that this is per 1,000 square feet.
Sorry, yes.
Correct?
Yeah.
Right.
But
little farther up.
Oh, sorry, it's on.
Oh, right. Yeah, you got it highlighted. Right.
Right there it is.
But the key with respect to the difference that we're getting with these changes is that you're saying that they can go to 80% versus 100% of this. So we're giving them a 20% free, yeah.
Flexibility, right. Yeah. Which with a lot of site constraints and the cost of parking spaces might be useful. And there are other kind of ways to increase the parking, like a solar canopy, right? Or structured parking, or more alternative fuel parking, or also ADA. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, I don't want to say yes to the ADA part without looking at it. I do know that regardless of any reductions that we allow here, we don't apply those to ADA. In other words,
okay. Right.
There's a federally established number that, you know, we can't tell somebody they can go below that. So
right.
That's true.
Okay, Chapin and then Kate.
Just wanted to mention that across Route 2A, from where we were just talking about, Kismet and the bank next to it share parking, and Kismet was allowed to go forward with fewer spaces than were in this table for their business. And it's working marvelously according to both participants, as far as I can tell. And I've talked to Sharon Gutwin about it. So the idea of sharing business to business when people know what their needs are is working, I think, quite well. And anyway, that's it. Thanks.
Okay. Kate, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that that makes sense, Chapin. But the reduction for commercial spaces might be a cause of Ron's problem, with the fact that the people from the hotels end up spilling out into the streets. So if they are allowed to have 20% less spaces, how much more is that going to affect situations like that? Noting that it's an isolated area. I don't know how it affects other spaces, but.
Yeah, and I'll note that, you know, I was out at the site Ron's talking about one morning, and because the lodging use in that case is an extended stay, there were 4 to 6 street spaces taken up by 2 U-Hauls, each with a car carrier. Because, you know, what homeowner waiting to move into their house wants to negotiate a hotel parking lot with a U-Haul pulling a car carrier?
Yeah.
Total sense, but that's a case that you know, we don't address. All we say about lodging is if it's also a conference center and restaurant, we should account for that.
Yeah, and honestly, probably if you have 1 per room here, which makes sense. Most people have 1 per room. However, if you go to 80% of that, you're going to have a problem, I would think, with respect to lodging.
Yeah, I will tell you from a market perspective, I think I would have to twist a hotel developer's arm to get them to build less than 100%. The Hilton folks at Finney were really adamant about their need for every single parking space that they proposed. So I mean, that's a question is, you know, to what extent does the town want to try to regulate this stuff? To what extent do we want to trust that someone's not going to build a hotel with less parking than they need? You know, it's a question of style and how much we want to regulate.
Thanks. Ron, go ahead.
I wanted to make sure everybody understands that there's the hamlet, and then to our immediate north is Chelsea Place. And at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night is when we really fill up because everybody's come in. And Chelsea Place has more constrained flow through it because everybody's parking on the streets. And we have less congestion on some of our streets because we're forcing homeowners off the street, just to throw that up. And then, and with the other issue with like the move-in, move-out days and people coming with their RV or with the U-Haul trailers, last year in August, I complained about a RV unit in the hotel running its air conditioning all night long for several days. So there's all sorts of conflicts there. Just FYI, it's the only reason why I throw that in. Of how do we get our arms around that? And it is real unique to this area, but half of us moved here because I sold the car to move into the hamlet because I wanted to live with a bicycle and a car, and that's not possible the way the configuration turned out now. So I like the idea of choking it down. The developer doesn't like that because he can't sell as many homes. He had to start adding a second garage to some of the later built homes in order for them to sell in a timely fashion. So it's a difficult algorithm that we're working on.
Okay. Okay, Alex, I saw your hand and then Chapin's.
Yeah, this is a great discussion, and I think that there's a lot of good language in here worth preserving, like around some of the stuff that has been highlighted across this discussion. I was just going to suggest that we could sort of go in circles on this for a really long time, sort of in the interest of horse trading, if you will. It's probably a better expression for it. I would love to propose just those two changes to the 1.5 in the earlier section we went over. I think it was 14.5.2, changing that to 2 per unit, and here changing it to 2 per unit. I would feel very comfortable voting for this with that change if everybody's willing to consider, sort of voting on it as amended.
Chapin, your comments?
I'm really close to where Alex was. I was going to give a stab at finding a place that we could agree to move this on. And it's what Alex said, except I didn't know if he also wanted to change accessory dwellings and multiple family dwellings back to their numbers. So I thought these 3 lines in front of us here would be the place to change, leaving the other part in about the 80%, which applies to the commercials, where we especially wanted to allow for fewer. So if that would be agreeable to people, I would love to see that.
Okay. Matt, can we check in on like where we are in terms of process? Are these proposed changes, first of all, are they clear to you, or you keep up to speed on them? And then also, are they minor enough that we could vote to move this on to the select board if we were in agreement?
I'll answer your last question first. Yes, I think these are minor enough that you could vote on them to move it forward to the select board. These are adjustments. They're not a 180 on the direction of the policy here at all. And then your second question is in terms of tracking them. So I have the 14.2.5.2, you can offset to street parking, but you must retain 2 spaces per dwelling unit equivalent on site. And that's a raising that from 1.5 to 2. And then on the table that I'm screen sharing, you would raise multiple family dwelling units to 2 per unit. And what that means is if somebody wanted to, they could follow that 80% essentially by right, and they could build 80% of 2 per unit. And just I get that as 1.6, Alex. I think you said 1.8 before.
Yeah, I said 1.8 or 1.6. I was trying to demonstrate that there was some range, but yeah, I agreed. It's 1.6, and that's the range that I feel most comfortable. So that'd be what I would motion if you'd entertain one. Under your chair.
And then presumably then, if they wanted something different, they can go through like a parking analysis as well.
Right.
Right. Okay. All right. So is everyone comfortable, understand where we are? Chapin, go ahead.
Just to clarify, I'm hearing from Alex, and I wanted to make sure this is true with other people too, that they're okay with these first two changes, that we don't specify how many you need for 1 and 2 family dwellings because we let the market drive that, or accessory dwellings. Is that right? We're only dealing with the multifamily?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think it needs to stay at no maximum for 1 and 2 families. Because if you have a garage and then you have a driveway, then you're having likely 4 spots.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was the intent, was to say we're not going to impose a maximum on 1 and 2 family dwellings. We're just going to let people build what they want to build.
Mm-hmm. And then Matt, we would revert the accessory dwellings to 2 reserved spaces. You said that you've only really seen studio apartments, but what are your thoughts on that?
So my experience has been, if we've had any 2-bedroom ADUs, I can't think of them. The square footage requirements generally are going to top most people out at a 900 square foot unit, which tends to be a studio or 1 bedroom. And it being accessory seems to generally trend towards a 1-person, 1-car occupant. That said, we only permit probably fewer than a dozen ADUs a year. Right. So the policy impact of this being 1 versus 2, I think I've had 1 where they had a hard time cramming 2 parking spaces in on their site. First off, an accessory dwelling is accessory to a 1-family home.
Okay.
So that's the only kind of accessory dwelling we use. We're never talking about being accessory to a unit in a duplex or accessory to an apartment in an apartment building. It's only accessory to single-family home. So, and there's an owner occupancy requirement on a property that has an ADU. So this is one where either the property owner thinks they can accommodate a tenant parking or they don't.
Right.
So I'm less worried about requiring more parking for an ADU, but if people are more comfortable leaving that alone and having it still say 2 for an ADU, I'm okay with that as well.
Presumably, if we have no maximum for a 1-family dwelling and they could then add an accessory, then it seems kind of silly to have a rule about the accessory dwelling. Right? You follow my logic?
I mean, when people propose an accessory apartment, we like to ask them, you know, where's the person who lives here going to park?
Right. Yeah.
To make sure they're not just not paying attention to that, or you know, they're really constrained and it's not going to work.
Right.
But usually people are able to draw an X somewhere on their giant driveway and say, sure, we'll have them park here.
So what language would you need in order to still just raise that question of parking for an accessory dwelling?
I think, well, leaving it at 1 means that it's required and someone needs to show me at least 1 parking space. If you feel like you really want people who are proposing an ADU to show 2 dedicated spaces, raise it to 2. But 1 lets me have the conversation.
Okay.
But this is just a maximum. I mean, yeah, technically they could go to 1 point something if it's that 80% thing and not 2.
Right.
But it's still a maximum. So putting it 2 doesn't really, I mean, there could be a caveat for this can go to 50% or something like that. So like they could have 1, but they could have 2. Right. The problem is if you don't allow them to have 2 at all by placing it at 1, then someone might have an issue if they have a couple moving in or something like that.
Right.
I'm going to make them put that second space under a solar carport. The ways you get to have more. So we're going to engineer their power mix as well as other Parker.
I thought we were removing the canopy.
It's a maximum. So that gives me an even higher comfort level if you just want to stick it back to 2.
Put it back to 2. Is that what you said? I'm sorry, Matt, I couldn't hear you. Okay. Okay, so we would then have 1 and 2 family dwellings, none, accessory dwellings, 2 reserved spaces. And then multifamily dwellings would be 2 per unit.
Yeah.
So is that correct, that the proposal we have on the table right now? Okay.
And what I heard about 1 and 2 was to change the word none to just say no maximum.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Shall we, is everybody comfortable on voting for the entire chapter amendments? Okay. And again, this would be to move it forward to the select board. Okay, so I'll entertain a motion then.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Kate. That's okay. It's all right.
Could we possibly increase the lodging uses to like 1.2 or something like that? I'm just thinking of like those bigger trucks that are parking. And if they, I mean, I know they probably wouldn't go down to 80%, but if you're leaving it at 1, they have no room.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, with lodging too, it seems like some of the issue is, seems like the pinch points have been primarily the long stay. Would I be correct in that, Matt?
Yeah.
Yeah, and my sense is that the vacancy rates of a lot of hotels in this area are pretty high for like quite a lot of the year. And that there are these sort of peak moments, but most of the time it's, not terribly crowded, except maybe for these long stay places, which sound like a little bit of a different beast, but perhaps I'm misinterpreting this. Ron, go ahead.
I would point out that we don't have lodging in the hamlet anymore. We have,
right.
So that's not an issue here anymore.
Okay. And then Alex, you were next.
I would just vote to keep it the same only because I sort of want to, these people are going to always want to put more parking, and I just sort of want to make them do a parking study.
Okay, fair enough. Chapin?
I was just going to make a joke and say, isn't that what the Walmart parking lot's for?
Right. The RVs, right?
the overflow of the long-term people, yeah.
Right.
Which is a poor joke. I'm okay with anything.
Okay.
But I think it probably is worth quantifying that we're talking about 4 lines in this document, 14.2.5.2, and then the 3 lines we're looking at right here. Each of them has a change.
That's right. Yeah. Okay, so are you okay leaving that at 1 per room, Kate?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't see it affecting me personally, so.
Okay. Okay, so I'll entertain a motion then to take a vote on moving this forward to the select board. Alex, are you moving?
Yep, I'll
okay.
First.
I'll
And
second.
Second, Ron. All right, all in favor in moving these amendments for Chapter 14 onto the select board as edited tonight. Say aye or raise your hand.
Aye.
Okay, we got unanimous consensus. Very nice, folks. Great. I feel like that was a really productive discussion. And Matt, hopefully that gives you material to work with, a little bit of homework.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Are there other chapter related amendment pieces that we need to address tonight, or does that finish our work on that?
I think that finishes your work. You voted to move all of the others forward before.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. All right, so then all I have left here is upcoming meetings, but there are other comments. I saw your hand, Chapin.
Yes, two things. One is about the discussion we just had. I wish our Senate, the US Senate would be willing to bargain and compromise. And I really appreciate all you guys, because it's good when we have a rich variety of opinions and when we're willing to work out to some decent compromises. The other is I was wondering if there's been any, I saw that the time that Jeff will be here has been moved out to later in September in your email, Matt. And I just wondered if there's been any official opening for the Planning Commission to be part of conversation before then, or should we have on our agenda next time the specific things that we are most concerned about, and should we be submitting them?
Yeah, so first off, please, as you come up with things you're concerned about, please submit them to me. I'll get them to Jeff. Thanks, Alex. And I'm going to be following up tomorrow with an email, but we have Jeff's schedule for when he's going to be here firmed up, and we've started to rough out what we want to do with his time. There's some of his time that we want to have him spend with the staff just working through the mechanics of administering a form-based code and understanding how one would work in Williston. But most of his time, we're trying to schedule visits to both Taft Corners and other places in the region that have form-based code or architectural elements that people want to walk and talk as they relate to what we're trying to do in Williston. So I have a rough schedule of that. We've brainstormed some of the locations, South Burlington, Winooski, Burlington, et cetera, that we would like to spend some time in, as well as some time in the areas of Taft Corners that we have some specific focus. So the staff and the CCRPC staff and Jeff have kind of brainstormed around that and roughed in a schedule, but I want to circulate that to all of you and get some feedback if we're missing something or something we want to make sure we cover while he's here. His visit's going to span a weekend. So there's some evening times and afternoon times and morning times, and there's also some weekend times in there. And I hope we can get folks to whatever of it they can make it to.
Can you remind us of which weekend that is?
Yeah, it's spanning, I believe it's the 17th, which is the Friday he arrives, and we have 18, 19, 20, 21 into that next week, I believe. I'm doing that from memory, but I'll bring it up while I'm.
Okay. Chapin, did you have something else?
Yeah, and that might be, in the end, there's a question for Matt about this, but part of what I felt is that there are reasons for things like street width that I don't necessarily appreciate, but I should understand as a planning commission member. I should be able to defend where we wind up. And Taylor did a good job of sort of pointing that out. And I'm wondering if in terms of the education of understanding constraints and reasons why things might be recommended the way they are by the consultant, whether what you just said about us attending things, Matt, would we as planning commissioners be free to tag along on any of these viewings so that we understood sort of what the underlying reasons were for any of the things that were proposed?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, some of what Jeff and I have talked about is looking at especially places where you have, you know, the building, the dooryard, the sidewalk, the green belt, the street, and literally throwing down a tape measure and making those dimensions real. So we can look at something and say, oh, I like that, or I don't like that. Well, here's what that translates into, you know, literal feet and inches. Or similarly, you know, what works as a more dense street frontage versus what just feels totally sterile and isn't working. So that's our focus. And I want to real quick while I'm talking, just share the schedule and correct it. I got the weekend right, but I loaded the weekday part into the wrong part of the week. So what we're looking at is actually, hopefully that's coming up. It's the 15th through Saturday, the 18th. So I had the weekend, but we're starting a little sooner. So Thursday, Friday, Saturday, 16, 17, 18, and you can see some of the discussion there. Red are areas we just haven't identified to do anything yet, but where we could do something. We're looking at more like late afternoon rather than early evening because we're starting to run into some sunset issues and wanting to be out. Although if anybody wants to walk around after dark in some of these places, we could do it. So this is just ideas. I'll circulate this. Please send me feedback or something like if you had a form-based code consultant working for you and there was one thing you really wanted to make sure they saw while they were here, let me know about it.
All right, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to definitely accompany some of this. Okay.
And form-based code is on our next agenda. What will we be doing about it?
Yeah. So I think at a minimum, we'll be running right out of that time with Jeff and be able to debrief around some of that. And I know you folks all had a vigorous conversation about the process while I was gone back on August 17th. And I've read through and watched some of that. And it's more than acceptable to keep kind of inquiring of Jeff about some of that procedural stuff. And, you know, I think in terms of some of the other feedback about, you know, we want to find some local examples for some of those pictures that stayed intent in the code. Thinking about ways that places end up being vibrant even in the winter because we have that here. You know, I'm hearing that. I've been kind of pushing on Jeff a little bit about making sure that we do that. And I mean, if I have to go out and take pictures to get the right pictures in the code, and that's what makes the code happen, we'll do it. So just wanted folks to know that, you know, I paid attention to that and heard that, and we're gonna stay on it. So I think next time it's likely to, as much as anything, to be a debrief of what we get to do on site, Jeff.
Great. All right, anything else?
No, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I have two quick things. One is tomorrow night, at a little plug here, because I'm also the vice chair of the Williston Historical Society. Tomorrow night at the Williston Central School auditorium, there's an event at 7 presenting a new book of historical photos. Let's see.
By Richard Allen.
Yep, by Richard Allen. You may have seen these. It's part of Arcadia Publishing series. They do them all over the country. Just came out, and you can buy the book. You can just sit and listen and hear stories about Williston and see funny old pictures and all that good stuff. It's only an hour, and so I just want to let everybody know about that. And then my last thing is, Kate, we need details of this puppy.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I'm actually just trying to keep her from peeing on the floor, you know, because she wakes up from her nap and then I have to hold her because I don't want her to pee. But this is Lily, and we got her last week. She's 9 weeks old. So my daughter's
so cute.
Yeah, she's a golden retriever. So.
All right, that's great. Well, I think we should let you go so she can go.
So to speak.
Meeting adjourned, I would say. Thank you, Lily.
9 o'clock.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.